What if the truth was so unbearable, that the moment you saw it, you could never unsee it? Sigmund Freud lived this danger. He was not just a doctor of the mind, he was a man who dared to reveal the hidden drives beneath civilization itself. But in doing so, Freud became both prophet and outcast, because to see what others refuse to see is not enlightenment, it is exile. Sigmund Freud was born into a world that wanted certainty. The late 19th century believed in progress, in reason, in science as the shining light that would explain all mysteries. Diseases were being traced to microbes, physics was unlocking the secrets of the universe, and Darwin had shown humanity's biological place in nature. People thought the final frontier was almost conquered, that human beings were fully rational creatures, conscious masters of their choices. But Freud saw something different. He noticed cracks beneath the polished surface of reason. He saw slips of the tongue, dreams that spoke in riddles, behaviors that defied logic. And he dared to suggest that the human being is not ruled by reason at all, but by something much darker, hidden beneath awareness. This was the birth of a dangerous vision, that man is not who he thinks he is. Imagine the shock of hearing this in Freud's time. Society prided itself on control, morality, and respectability. Yet Freud argued that every respectable gentleman carried in him a storm of impulses, sexual desires, violent urges, secret fears, that he himself could not fully recognize. The mind, he claimed, was not a clean room illuminated by thought but a basement filled with forgotten, repressed, and forbidden things. When people laughed at jokes, Freud suspected they revealed hidden wishes. When they dreamed, he heard whispers from the unconscious. Even when they made mistakes in speech or action, he saw clues to what was truly boiling underneath. To most, this was indecent, even scandalous. But to Freud, it was undeniable. This ability to see differently has always carried danger. Socrates asked questions no one wanted to answer, and he was given hemlock. Nietzsche declared that God was dead, and he went mad in the solitude of his vision. Freud's crime was similar. He stripped away the comforting idea that humans are rational masters of themselves. He told people that their polite lives were built on repression, that morality was not purity but disguise, that civilization itself was a fragile mask covering animal drives. Where others saw order, Freud saw barely contained chaos. And like every prophet of uncomfortable truth, he was met with mockery, outrage, and exile. Think about what it means to live with such a vision. Most of us accept the social script: we work, we marry, we behave. We prefer the illusion that we are in control. But Freud could not look away. Every patient he studied, every dream he analyzed, confirmed that beneath the mask of consciousness lived a force far stronger than willpower, the unconscious. He once said, "The ego is not master in its own house." In other words, the very thing you call I is not truly in charge. A sentence like this destroys the pride of an entire culture. It suggests we are strangers to ourselves, passengers carried by currents we cannot see. Freud's early discoveries were not just medical theories, they were accusations against the foundations of civilization. When he claimed that children had complex desires long before morality was learned, society was horrified. When he traced religious belief to deep psychological needs, he was accused of blasphemy. He was not simply healing patients, he was dismantling myths. And this is the true danger of seeing what others don't. It places you against the very fabric of the world that surrounds you. To recognize that truth is not where society says it is, to recognize that the noble human being is also a creature of instinct and taboo, this vision isolates the thinker. Because once you see it, you cannot return to the innocence of the crowd. This is the cost Freud paid. He walked a path where very few could follow, armed only with the courage to face the uncomfortable reality that man is not master of himself. Freud's next step was even more unsettling. It was not enough to say that the unconscious ruled the individual. He began to argue that the unconscious shaped entire civilizations. For him, society itself was not simply a noble achievement of reason, but a compromise built upon denial and suppression. Human beings, he observed, are born with two dominating forces: the drive toward pleasure and the drive toward survival. On one side stands the pleasure principle, the deep, instinctual urge to seek satisfaction, whether in food, comfort, sex, or aggression. On the other side stands the reality principle, the demand of the external world that we restrain these urges in order to live together. Civilization, in Freud's view, is nothing but the uneasy truce between these two opposing forces. Consider what this means. Every law, every moral code, every polite custom exists because, without restraint, human beings would be ruled by instinct alone. Society tells us not to steal, not to kill, not to sleep with whomever we desire, but the very need for such rules proves that those desires exist in the first place. Civilization's order is built on a foundation of what it forbids. Freud suggested that the structures of culture, religion, art, politics, are not just noble expressions of the human spirit but also mechanisms to control the dangerous impulses lurking beneath the surface. We sacrifice instinct to gain safety, but the sacrifice comes with a cost, perpetual inner tension. This tension is what Freud described in Civilization and its discontents. Imagine the human being as an animal caged by its own creations. We built the cage ourselves, but we are also trapped inside it. We long for freedom, yet we fear what would happen if freedom were fully unleashed. The very comforts of modern life, the safety of laws, the warmth of community, are achieved by suppressing our most primal energies. And suppressed energy does not simply vanish. It lingers in the unconscious, pressing for release, emerging in strange symptoms, neuroses, dreams, or eruptions of violence. Civilization is therefore never at peace, it is always haunted by the drives it represses. Freud gave this struggle a language: eros, the life instinct, and thanatos, the death instinct. Eros seeks pleasure, growth, union. Thanatos seeks aggression, destruction, the return to silence. Society forces us to sublimate, redirecting these raw instincts into acceptable outlets. Sexual desire becomes romance or art. Aggression becomes competition in business or sport. But sublimation is never perfect. There is always a remainder, a leftover force that cannot be neatly transformed. That remainder is what gnaws at the foundations of civilization. Wars, revolutions, even sudden acts of cruelty in daily life, these, Freud would argue, are the return of what society tries to bury. The Stoics centuries earlier had preached that to live well, one must align with nature, accept the limits of desire, and cultivate inner freedom. Freud's insight was darker. Modern man does not align with nature but instead fights against it daily, repressing instincts in order to maintain order. While Marcus Aurelius spoke of discipline as a noble harmony with the universe, Freud described discipline as a constant inner war. Civilization asks us to smile, to work, to obey, while our unconscious strains against the leash. This inner battle produces guilt, frustration, and anxiety. We think of these as personal problems, but Freud saw them as the unavoidable byproducts of civilization itself. Think about modern life. We live in a world of laws, social norms, and endless screens projecting how we should act and look. Yet beneath that surface, we see scandals, addictions, bursts of violence, obsessions that refuse to stay hidden. Freud would say, of course. Civilization demands repression, and repression always leaks out. The smile on the office worker's face may conceal rage. The respectable leader may harbor secret vices. The family gathered at the dinner table may sit in silent hostility. For Freud, the cracks are not exceptions, they are the rule. This is why Freud's vision was so dangerous. He told us that our social order was not a triumph of morality but a fragile compromise. He dared to whisper that our laws and customs are masks worn over a seething, instinctual core. Every handshake hides aggression, every polite word suppresses desire. Civilization, then, is not a cure for our nature but an elaborate disguise. And the more perfectly we wear the mask, the more pressure builds underneath. To see more than others is not simply an intellectual achievement, it is also a burden that isolates the one who carries it. Freud knew this intimately. He was not only a man of science but also a man increasingly separated from the very culture he tried to illuminate. The discoveries he made, the theories he proposed, were like torches held up in a room where everyone else preferred the dark. And when you hold such a torch, you find yourself standing alone. Knowledge, especially forbidden knowledge, has a price. It does not simply enlighten, it estranges. Freud's life became a study in this estrangement. In his early years, he already felt the weight of difference. His insistence on the reality of the unconscious, on the role of sexuality in human development, and on the deep irrationality hidden beneath civilized life put him at odds with colleagues who preferred the safety of conventional theories. The medical establishment dismissed him as eccentric, sometimes even as obscene. What he saw as scientific truth, others condemned as moral danger. And slowly, a circle of isolation formed around him. He became the one who dared to say aloud what everyone else wanted buried. This burden was not only professional but deeply personal. Freud built relationships with brilliant minds, men like Carl Jung, whom he hoped would carry the torch of psychoanalysis into the future. Yet even these bonds fractured. Jung could not remain confined to Freud's framework. He ventured into mysticism and archetypes, diverging from Freud's more clinical vision. For Freud, this was not just a theoretical disagreement, it was a betrayal, a confirmation that even those closest to him could not fully share the vision he carried. To see differently meant, time and again, to stand alone. This loneliness is not unique to Freud. History is filled with figures who paid the same price. Nietzsche, who stared into the abyss of meaninglessness, became consumed by the visions only he could see, collapsing into madness while the world mocked him. Galileo, who looked through his telescope and saw a universe that contradicted the Church's doctrine, was forced to live under house arrest, exiled from the community of believers. Even Socrates, the gadfly of Athens, was condemned for corrupting the youth with his relentless questioning. To see what others cannot, or will not, see is to step outside the shared dream that binds society together. And outside that dream lies solitude. Psychologically, the burden is immense. Most people are content with illusions, they rely on them to live. But the one who pierces those illusions cannot return to ignorance. It is like awakening in the middle of a dream and realizing that everyone else is still asleep. The awakened one tries to explain, but his words sound like nonsense to those still dreaming. Freud, in his own way, was this figure. He tried to reveal the forces shaping human life, desire, repression, the unconscious, but to many, his insights sounded grotesque, even dangerous. The lonely burden of knowledge is not only being ignored but being hated for what you reveal. Modern life offers endless examples of this same pattern. Whistleblowers who expose corruption are not celebrated as heroes, they are exiled, discredited, or destroyed. Innovators who introduce ideas too far ahead of their time are dismissed as madmen until years later, when the world is finally ready to catch up. Even in smaller, everyday moments, when someone points out an uncomfortable truth within a family or community, they risk becoming the scapegoat, the one shunned, not because they are wrong, but because they have spoken what others cannot bear to hear. Freud's burden was simply a larger, more dramatic version of this universal experience. Philosophy and psychology remind us that such isolation is almost inevitable. Nietzsche wrote of the loneliness of the great man, the one who must walk ahead of his time. Jung spoke of the shadow, the dark side of the psyche that most refuse to confront, but which the rare individual dares to face. Freud's life embodies both of these truths. He carried insights others denied, and he wrestled with shadows others pretended did not exist. His burden was not merely intellectual discovery but the emotional weight of living in a world that could not share his vision. And yet, the thinker continues. For once the mind has opened to these deeper layers of reality, retreat is impossible. Freud knew he could not unsee the unconscious. He knew he could not return to a world where human beings were viewed as rational, clean, and transparent. He had glimpsed the machinery beneath the mask, and that glimpse condemned him to live with the knowledge, even if it meant walking alone. The lonely burden of knowledge is that it separates the seer from the crowd, binding him not to the comfort of community but to the harsh truth of what he has seen. The danger of seeing too much is not only the loneliness of the one who sees, but also the fierce resistance of those who do not. Freud understood this as well as anyone. His theories did not simply uncover hidden truths about individuals, they struck at the heart of the collective psyche. People resist uncomfortable truths because these truths threaten the very stories that hold their lives together. If an individual represses memories or desires to protect the ego, then societies repress knowledge to protect their cohesion. And just as the unconscious of a person pushes back against what it cannot bear, the unconscious of a culture rises in denial, outrage, and hostility toward the one who exposes what lies beneath. Freud named these forces defense mechanisms. Denial, projection, rationalization, all the ways we twist reality to preserve comfort. What he observed in his patients, we see magnified in entire populations. The masses cannot tolerate too much reality at once, so they lash out at those who deliver it. Consider the way his early writings on sexuality were received. To suggest that children had complex desires or that repression was the foundation of morality sounded like blasphemy. It was easier for people to ridicule him, to dismiss him as perverse, than to question whether he had touched a forbidden truth. The crowd does not hate the lie, it hates the man who unmasks it. This resistance is not only psychological but also deeply social. Civilization, as Freud argued, is built on repression. To challenge repression is to threaten the fragile balance that keeps society intact. Most people cannot imagine living without their illusions, for illusions provide meaning, safety, and belonging. Religion, nationalism, morality, these are the narratives that bind the many into a collective. To call them into question is not simply to argue an intellectual point but to destabilize an entire order. This is why so many thinkers throughout history have been met not with debate but with punishment. Socrates was silenced with poison, Bruno burned at the stake, and Freud himself ostracized by polite society. Resistance is not accidental, it is the immune system of the collective, designed to protect the dream from the intrusion of truth. In our time, we see this same mechanism play out in new forms. Social media amplifies it to a fever pitch. The moment someone speaks an uncomfortable reality, the collective rushes to defend itself with outrage, mockery, or censorship. Outrage often hides fear, mockery disguises anxiety. The pattern is ancient. When faced with truths that threaten the foundations of identity, people react not with curiosity but with hostility. The Stoics knew this long ago. Epictetus warned that most men are not prepared for philosophy, because philosophy threatens to strip away their illusions. Marcus Aurelius admitted that human beings cling to comfort rather than confront the brevity of life. Freud's insight sharpened this observation into psychological clarity. What is true is often intolerable, and what is intolerable must be resisted. Projection is one of the most revealing forms of this resistance. When people are confronted with truths about aggression, sexuality, or desire, they often accuse the speaker of being obsessed or corrupt. In reality, they are projecting their own discomfort outward, attacking the messenger instead of facing the message. Freud became the target of such projections. His insistence on the role of unconscious drives was dismissed as evidence of his own supposed perversity. But this very dismissal confirmed his point: people defend against unbearable truths by casting them onto others. It is easier to call Freud sick than to admit that sickness lies at the root of the civilized self. Yet this resistance is not only external, it exists within each of us. How often do we deny what is obvious, invent rationalizations for our choices, or distract ourselves to avoid facing mortality, desire, or guilt? Freud did not simply reveal the unconscious as an abstract idea, he showed how it governs our daily lives. The same patterns that silenced him are the patterns that silence us internally. We fear the consequences of admitting too much, so we bury what we know, even from ourselves. The crowd within us mirrors the crowd outside. Both work tirelessly to preserve illusion. This is why those who see too much are so dangerous. They not only threaten the illusions of society but awaken the truths we try to bury in ourselves. To hear Freud was not just to learn about the unconscious, it was to confront one's own repressed drives, one's own hidden desires and fears. The resistance of the masses, then, is not simply a defense of culture but a defense of the self. People do not want to know, and they will punish those who force them to know. And so, the pattern repeats across time. The seer, the thinker, the prophet, always finds himself at odds with the many. Not because he is wrong, but because he is intolerably right. Civilization depends on its fictions, and the one who strips them away is treated as an enemy. Freud, like those before him, paid this price. To uncover the machinery of repression is to challenge the very foundation of human togetherness. The masses cannot tolerate this. They will resist it with every weapon available, because to lose their illusions is, for them, to lose their very lives. There is a final danger in seeing what others cannot, the risk that vision itself becomes unbearable, that the weight of too much truth presses the seer beyond the limits of sanity. Freud understood this not only in theory but in his own life. To stare constantly into the unconscious is to live in close proximity to chaos, to wrestle daily with forces most people spend their lives avoiding. It is one thing to observe repression in others, it is another to feel the endless tide of instinct, desire, and death drive pressing from within oneself. The human mind is not infinite. It was not built to hold the full scale of truth without trembling. Freud came to recognize this fragility in his later years. His early ambition was to expose the hidden machinery of the psyche, but as time passed, his vision grew darker, more pessimistic. He began to see civilization not as progress but as a brittle compromise, forever threatened by the very instincts it sought to contain. The human being, in his view, was condemned to conflict without resolution. To know this is not simply to possess an idea, it is to live with the constant awareness that peace is an illusion. Such knowledge does not free, it corrodes. It weighs down the spirit with a kind of tragic inevitability. Other thinkers reveal the same pattern. Nietzsche, who dared to declare that God was dead and that human beings must forge their own meaning, was consumed by visions too heavy for his mind to bear. He collapsed into madness, unable to live with the abyss he had revealed. Carl Jung, Freud's great rival and once his disciple, nearly drowned in the flood of archetypes and mythic images that overwhelmed him during his confrontation with the unconscious. He wrote of nearly losing his mind, saved only by the discipline of turning visions into art and theory. The line between genius and madness is not an exaggeration, it is the razor's edge walked by anyone who dares to see too much. What makes this danger so insidious is that it hides within the very act of insight. The clearer the vision, the greater the exposure to truths that the psyche finds intolerable. To see repression is to recognize the endless war inside each human being. To see the death drive is to confront that part of ourselves that longs not for life but for silence, destruction, and return to nothingness. To see civilization as repression is to strip away every comforting narrative of progress and to admit that our highest achievements are also our deepest compromises. Each step further into truth removes a layer of protection, until the seer stands naked before reality itself. Few can endure that sight without trembling. This danger extends into the modern world in ways Freud could never have predicted. Today we live surrounded by information, analysis, constant exposure to data and hidden mechanisms of power. Many who immerse themselves too deeply in these layers of reality find themselves spiraling into paranoia, nihilism, or despair. The mind craves meaning, but when meaning is dismantled over and over, what remains is a void that can swallow the spirit. This is the same risk Freud described in his darker works. The more one understands the unconscious drives behind human behavior, the harder it becomes to believe in virtue, in innocence, in the stories that allow life to feel bearable. Consider the burnout of those who spend their lives analyzing systems of power, the paranoia of those who obsess over conspiracies, the numbness of those who see every act as merely the product of hidden motives. These are contemporary echoes of Freud's final insight, that vision can become poison if it is not tempered by limits. To know too much about the fragility of civilization, the inevitability of repression, the endless cycle of desire and frustration, is to risk being crushed by the very knowledge one has gained. Wisdom is not merely the accumulation of truth, it is also the capacity to survive truth. Freud himself never lost his clarity, but he did lose his hope. His final works are steeped in resignation, portraying human beings as creatures fated to suffer under the tension between instinct and order, forever bound to dissatisfaction. He could not unsee what he had discovered, and so he bore the cost, a lifetime of alienation, suspicion, and the heavy weight of a vision that could not be softened. His gift was also his curse. To open the eyes of humanity was to doom himself to a kind of inner exile, trapped in a reality few could bear to face. This is the final danger of seeing what others do not. The mind that peers too deeply into the abyss risks not only rejection by others but collapse within itself. To perceive truth is powerful, to perceive too much truth is perilous. The seer must balance on the edge of revelation and survival, daring to hold the torch without letting it consume him. For the fire that illuminates the world can just as easily burn the one who carries it. To see what other men don't is both a gift and a curse. Freud's danger was not simply discovering hidden truths about desire and death, it was daring to live with them. The question is not, can you open your eyes? The question is, once you see, will you still be able to live among the blind?